Hello and welcome to Book Talk. I'm Sherry Del Bracco, your host, and today we are honored to have as our guest Michael McGarrity, who is going to talk to us about his latest book, Everyone Dies. Welcome to Memphis and welcome to Book Talk.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
I want to talk to you, before we talk about the book, I want to talk to you about your background. When I read about it, I thought it was just absolutely fascinating, and I thought we could probably spend the entire segment talking about that, but we won't.
Good, because that would really bore me.
You have a BA in psychology and an MA in clinical social work, and you also have had quite an extensive and very successful career in law enforcement and as a policeman. And then also you're a trained psychotherapy and you had your own family practice, is that correct?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, I did all those things. I was never the kind of person who thought that I just wanted to do one thing in my life. But if you look at my career overall, you will see that virtually all of it encompassed the criminal justice system in one way or another. Whether it was in law enforcement or corrections. I even spent some time rebuilding the mental health services for the state of New Mexico after the riot at the penitentiary. I worked with drug abusers, ex-felons, people coming into halfway house programs, juvenile delinquents, truancy problems, chronically mentally ill patients, many of whom are always involved in the justice system one way or another because of the seriousness of their illness. And then law enforcement and the sex crimes unit. And that was really kind of what I was drawn to professionally, was working with the underclass, if you can call them that, the least advantaged people that are in our society, and the ones that are most needy of services, and frequently the ones that commit the crimes. So if you take my careers and put them in that package, you'll see that there was some sort of continuity to it. I mean, I don't want you to make me out to be a total flake who just skipped around from job to job.
Oh, no. Actually, I think probably the question that most viewers would have is, how is it that you do everything? You've done it. You've been a success at just so many different things. Well, what is it that you cannot do?
Not everybody would characterize me that way, I'm sure, because I'm Irish and I can be difficult and even known upon occasion to be abrasive, somewhat arrogant at times, I've been told. But I always felt that if you were going to do something, do it the best you could. Try to achieve some sort of professionalism.
Well, you've obviously been very successful with that. Now, in 1996, you wrote you had your debut novel, your first novel, Tularosa.
That's right.
And it was an award-nominated book. You were very successful with that. And so that's when you decided to commit yourself full-time to writing. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, actually, I looked at the bottom line. I had sold my first two novels to a New York publishing house without an agent, which I was told later on is impossible to do.
That's
amazing. They, in turn, turned around and sold the paperback rights to Pocketbooks, which is part of Simon & Schuster. And I basically looked at the bottom line and said, I don't need to work a day job anymore, which is incredible. I mean, I think it's almost like a fantasy story for a writer to actually be able to do that.
Because, it really is.
Because so many books come out and they fall into what I call the black hole, where they're never heard from again. And I truly expected that to happen to me, which wasn't unsettling at all, because I was just very proud of the fact that I had achieved this goal of publishing a novel and having it in print. And so when all this extra stuff started happening, with Tularosa being nominated for national awards and being picked as a collectible book of the year, and word of mouth spreading, and I go on a book tour as a result of this, and I find out that people are really liking what I do and I'm getting great reviews, it was kind of like icing on the cake.
Oh yeah, you were on your way. Well, what was it initially, though, that inspired you to start writing? Was there any particular
I'm a country boy. I grew up reading. I had a mother.
What did you like to read?
Well, I read Horatio Hornblower book there was. I mean, I lived in the desert, and I didn't know anything about the ocean, but, you know, it sounded like fun to me, so I would read books like that. I would read, one of my favorite books from my youth was a novel nobody's heard of that was written by, I think, a Hungarian gentleman that was a book on Galileo called The Stargazer, and I loved that book. So I wasn't a good student. I was born, fortunately, before they started labeling kids in school. Otherwise, I probably would have gotten one of those labels, because I was kind of an antsy kid who couldn't stay still, who wasn't that interested in doing anything more than, when I was young, riding horses and hanging out, and then when I got older, of course, girls became much more interesting than school ever could be. But I was always a reader. I was always devouring books, and we would go to town, and one of the weekend trips would always be a visit to the local library. I love libraries. I do a lot of library events, actually, all over the Southwest, and pick up the stash of books that you needed for the week. And I was more inclined to be reading that than I was to be studying or doing my homework. And my mom was a reader, and family was a reader, and this was back in the days before television had really taken off and sort of consumed our lives. So that sort of followed me through life, this desire and love of reading. And I finally, later on in life, figured out I might have been smart enough to even go to college, which I did successfully. And but it never kept me from the enjoyment of personal reading. I know a lot of professional people talk about, oh, I don't have time to read in my profession,
yes,
right?
That can be a problem.
And I kind of, you know, get a little antsy when I hear that, because it doesn't have to be that way. I mean,
that's a priority for you.
I like to read across a lot of different areas. And I think anybody who loves to read and loves a good novel, loves fiction, probably has a thought in the back of their mind that they'd like to see if they could do it. You know, can I write anything? And that's really how it got started. I just decided that question had been popping around in my mind long enough, it was time for me to put it to the test. So I sat down one summer after I had left a job and had taken a couple of months off, and started writing.
Well, now tell us, typically in a day of your writing, how do you do this on a computer, or do you do it with?
No, I do it on a keyboard, but I sit in front of a computer.
Okay, and you devote about how many hours a day to this?
I have no idea.
You don't know? Do you write in the morning, or
I'm a morning guy. You know, I'm like up at 5 usually, and I have my coffee and stare at the walls for a few minutes in total silence. You know, it's wonderful. And since I work at home, you know, I don't have to worry about, well, do I have to shave now? You know, do I have to look like a human being? And I usually wander into my little office and sit down and go to work. Now, sometimes I write and sometimes I don't, because I'm not the kind of person who outlines everything from A to Z. I know how the story starts. I know where I want to put my characters. I do a lot of location scouting for myself. And I have a working title, which I may or may not keep. And that's really all I need to get started, to get rolling. So at times I can't write because I'm still in the process of figuring out what's going on, you know. And my joke is that I can go to work in the morning, sit down, and what's going to happen is still a mystery to me. I mean, I'm a mystery writer who's in the midst of his own mystery as the book progresses. So, but it's a very creative, involving process for me. And a lot of things happen, like characters will sort of knock on my psychic door and say, you got to let me into this book. You know, and I had no intention of maybe bringing back a character from an earlier book into the one I'm working on, and yet it works and it feels natural, and so I do it. Or some idea that comes from maybe research I did 4 or 5 or 6 books ago will pop into my head that I hadn't used before, but it makes perfect sense to use it now. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the way it happens.
Well, that's fascinating.
It's very strange.
Everyone Dies is the 9th entry in a series.
8th.
Oh, is it the 8th? I'm sorry.
That's all right. No.
Okay, the 8th entry of
maybe
series.
I wrote another book that I just don't remember.
That features this character named Kevin Kerney.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about Kevin a little bit, if you can. He's the chief of police of the Santa Fe, at Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Right,
yeah.
Well, I started with Kevin. It's really interesting. When I sat down to write a story, I had this character in my head, and it really turned out to be him. And I subconsciously, I think, was writing against the prevailing protagonist in mystery fiction who seems to be the loose cannon, the fellow with a lot of emotional baggage. You've got all these protagonists who are in recovery from alcoholism or can't establish a good relationship with a member of the opposite sex, or suffering from sort of post-traumatic stress disorder of one type or another. And I wanted a character that was intact, who wasn't emotionally damaged in serious ways, but was interesting because he did have a sense of right and wrong, had a moral point of view, was excellent at what he did and liked what he did. And so that became Kerney as a character. When he starts out, I had to find the right story for him. You see, the first couple of manuscripts I wrote with Kerney in them were really, they were terrible. They were just bad. I mean, they will never see the light of day. And so I had a great character, but I needed a good story for him. And that's when Tularosa came to mind, because I was able to draw on some of the fictional background that I had created for him, being ranch born and raised on the Tularosa Basin in south central New Mexico, where his family loses the ranch because the military takes it over after World War II for their high security missile range, White Sands Missile Range. And so I had Kerney, and then when I was able to tie that into some of the backstory of his personal life, Tularosa took off. So Kerney has had a couple of different roles. He's been medically retired. That's where we meet him in Tularosa, and gets caught up in looking into the disappearance of his godson, who's a soldier at White Sands. From there, he becomes a seasonal park ranger in the next book, and eventually does investigations for the state police, and even gets promoted to become deputy chief of the state police before he lands this job as chief of the Santa Fe Police Department, which is the job he always wanted, because that's where he started his law enforcement career, and that's where he was working when he had gotten wounded and had been forced to take a medical retirement. So he's evolving. The other thing,
is he an alter ego at all of yours? There's none of Michael McGarrity and Kevin Kerney at all? Just the Irish names are the same?
That's an interesting question. I'd like to answer it sort of in a roundabout way. What I try to do as a writer is be invisible inside the story. I know that as a person I have attitudes, values, points of view, opinions, beliefs that are going to filter in to what I do as a writer. I mean, it's impossible not to have that filter in. But what I have to do is make them an integral part of each character, whether it's Kerney or somebody else. If someone has a stand to take or a point of view to offer, to me it has to be an integral part of that character's personality in order for it to work. If I don't do it that way, what happens is I'll wind up soapboxing or preaching to the audience, so to speak, and as a reader, that really interrupts me when I'm reading a book, when sort of the author all of a sudden just pops up into the scene and says, you know, here's something you ought to believe in, or here's something that I believe in that I want you to believe in.
That might seem artificial.
I think it can interrupt the action and the flow, and so what I try to do is hide. The only thing I would like a reader to do at the end of the book is perhaps close the cover and say, McGarrity's told another good story. That to me would be the highest kind of praise. So no, Kerney isn't me. As a matter of fact, he's a much nicer person than I am.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes, absolutely. But he's the kind of guy that I would love to have as a friend.
Yes.
What pleases me, though, is that I have found over the course of the last 8 years that men respect him and women like him. And I take that also as praise, that they see this fellow as somebody who is authentic and real and valuable and worthy of liking him. And so that means a lot to me.
In this particular story, we learn about Sara Brannon, who is Kevin's wife. Now, she's pregnant. She also has a very interesting career as the lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army Military Police. So there was some reason that you wanted Sara to have such a very interesting
It's the only kind of women I can write about, are women who are independent and independent and tough-minded and fair-minded. I mean, this is the kind of mother I had. My mother was a Montana ranch girl, and we used to call her the top kick, the top sergeant, because she was this absolutely stunningly beautiful woman who was as tough as nails if she had to be. And I used to tell her that she spoiled me for cheerleaders and pom-pom girls and Playboy bunnies. You know? And so I can only write about, as I said earlier, what I know. And the kind of women that I know the best are women who are strong-willed and independent, and that's what Sara is. And one of the things that I found interesting, he meets her actually in the debut novel. I mean, that's where he first encounters her, is in Tularosa. Here's Kerney, who's approaching middle age. He's in middle age, and wanting to build a family, which is something he hasn't had. He's lost his family. He had one short, unsuccessful marriage that didn't work out. And he's longing for that. He's longing to build a family. And along comes Sara Brannon, who's a West Point graduate, who's on the fast track in the Army, who has a career of her own and a mind of her own. And Kerney, who's similar in his own way. And how do you bring them together? Well, I don't think it would be tremendously interesting dramatically if Sara said, okay, I love you, I'll quit my career and stay home and have your babies. I mean, having a long-distance marriage, I thought, gave me an opportunity to really deal with some issues that might be of interest to the reader. They're certainly of interest to me. I don't even know if these two guys are going to be able to stay together. I mean, that's still up in the air, but I have hopes for them. You know, I want them to. So I think when you have those kinds of characters, you have all this opportunity to have interesting byplay go on and interesting tension elements get created that I think are authentic and real.
Dynamics are very strong. Yeah. In the story, as it goes, though, that they are waiting on the birth of their baby.
That's right.
And then something ensues. There's a murder that happens. A prominent gay attorney is murdered. Mm-hmm. And then this is when the story really takes off.
Yeah, well, it takes off right on page 1, doesn't it?
Yes. Yes, and there's a lot of killing in the book.
There's a lot of violence. I don't think it's gratuitous. I don't do that. I don't do a lot of profanity in my work, I don't even write a lot of sex scenes. I like what happens. I like the tension that develops between men and women. I like to write about that more than I do the intimacy, the physical intimacy thing. That's something that I'm very private about, and I wish more people would be, you know, actually. But what this story really kicks off is the idea of a revenge killer, somebody who has an agenda and a plan and has carefully laid it out to go after those people he thinks have wronged him. In this case, the ultimate target becomes Kerney, Sara, and their unborn son, Patrick Brannon. I don't know what kind of stronger instinctual instinct there is in human nature other than the desire to protect one's family.
Right.
And that's really part of the story, a very important part of the story. Because the predator, and that's exactly what he is very cold-blooded, and he's willing to do everything he can to ratchet up the fear that he wants Kerney to experience before he comes after him. One of the things I like to say is that you can put 12 homicides on the page in a mystery book, and most readers won't be bothered by it at all, but if you destroy an animal, you can be in big trouble. I decided
that wasn't going to be my next question.
I decided to
tell us about this.
I decided to roll the dice. One thing that I've learned as a writer is it's much better to show something than it is to tell something. If you show what's happening rather than try to explain it to people, it flows more naturally, I believe, in the story. One way to do that is to show that this perpetrator, his total disregard for life, for other people's life. And to do that through a sequence that takes it from homicide to taking away from people those things that they value. In the first chapter of Everyone Dies, not only does Kerney have to go out and see this homicide, which is of a lawyer that he liked and respected, but he then goes to his ranch property and finds that his horse that he gentled and trained has been slaughtered, basically. So I've got animals that get killed, and I felt that the dramatic tension of that in terms of showing how much this man, this perpetrator, wants his targets to suffer before he kills them, was the right thing to do.
Do you think that your career and your background with, you know, as being a policeman and everything, and all of the other fine things you've done, helps you draw? Surely, I'm sure it does to some extent, but I mean, the violence is I thought was pretty intense sometimes, and
you bet.
So how is it that you go about laying that out and imagining that?
Most people only have a very passing experience, if at all, with acts of violence, and they don't see it. I felt in this particular story to go ahead and show some of it at its rawest form, which I've seen in real life. That may be hard on the reader at times.
Is it hard on you?
No, not necessarily. No.
Okay.
I don't. You know, the side. I'm not saying I'm a tough guy. I mean, whenever you see death, whenever you see somebody with their head stuck through a windshield, or gut shot, or bleeding to death on a sidewalk, it's never pretty, and you know, you don't have sort of a Clint Eastwood reaction to it, you have a human reaction to it, but you're focused and you've got to get on and do the job. So you don't have the luxury of letting down then, you let down later, right? You sort of defer the emotional reaction until, you know, you're away from the situation and you can kind of decompress. But I, as a writer, am the type of guy who must draw on experience. Now, it's not all experience. You know, I take certain things and fictionalize them. And not everything that I've written about is necessarily a case that I have personally investigated or cleared. But there's enough elements there from my own experience that I can wrap around it and use it. And I have all sorts of resources in the law enforcement community. I spent 4 days at Quantico in Virginia in April at their request, and had a wonderful time and got a great amount of research material done, and they even taught a course while I was there. So I try to stay up to date and current on what's happening with law enforcement investigative techniques and other technical aspects to it, and just stay connected. So it's sort of an amalgamation of experience and imagination and research.
That's very fascinating. Let's talk a little bit about the fact that the location of all of your books has been in New Mexico.
It's the only place I know. You know.
Well, for those of us and for viewers who are watching who perhaps have not been there, tell us about what it is that you find so captivating that you want to always use that as your settings.
It's geographically, culturally rich, and even historically rich. I mean, we're part of the old Wild West, and there's still that element to it. We have a history that predates the founding fathers arriving on Plymouth Rock. You know, we have the Spanish conquistadors who came in. We have native people who still live on their ancestral land. We have everything from the low desert in the southern part of the state to the high desert in the subalpine mountains. We have this vast multicultural environment of Hispanic, Anglo, and Native American people, and this rich history of Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett and the Lincoln County Wars, and everything right up to including all of the 20th century that goes on, Trinity Site, the atom bomb, Los Alamos, You know, I could go on and on. Do you have another 30 minutes? So we can just continue to talk about it. And I've always had this love affair with my home state, and I've been a voracious reader of New Mexico biography, New Mexico history. I know the state well. I've ridden it, trampled it, hiked it, driven it, just spent endless amounts of time out on it, and I in a lifetime I'll never get to see it all. It's the 5th largest state physically in the Union, and we're still predominantly rural. You know, 1.8 million people with half a million people in our biggest city, and that's it. So it's this vast, open Western landscape that just enriches me in terms of setting and character and
that's wonderful.
And even plot idea.
Yes.
I can weave in some history here and there.
In your book, you have much, description of not only Santa Fe but New Mexico, and I find that to be interesting that you weave that in.
Well, the 3 elements, basic elements of any good novel, it seems to me, is setting, character, and plot. And I don't skimp. I think the setting, in some ways, actually helps, and you may find this hard to believe, I hope you don't, but I think it actually helps define who you are.
Oh, wow.
You know, where you come from helps define who you are. And a lot of urban people have a bit of a problem with that, because they just take their setting for granted, right?
Yes, of course.
But in reality, they're affected by their environment, and we all are. And so that plays a very critical element in the way I think when I develop characters.
That's great. Well, tell us now, are any of these books that you've written, have they been made into movies or?
No, nobody's made an offer I can't refuse.
Well, what's next for you? Are you writing another Kevin Kerney novel?
I'm halfway through it. This guy is so interesting to me, I'm just not willing to let go of him right yet. I mean, you can look at all these books and say, well, he's got 8 out. Or you can say, well, no, this is really 8 chapters in the life of one man. Mm-hmm. And I'm already on chapter 9. So it's kind of like an anthology, I guess, of
Yes.
one man's life, along with a lot of other interesting characters that people his world. So I'm halfway through the next one. It's called Slow Kill. And interestingly enough, I'm opening this. This is the first book. Only one other book has been opened outside of New Mexico, and that was Hermit's Peak, which opens with Sarah, his not yet wife, serving her tour of duty in Korea.
Wow.
And I thought that was fun to do, to open with Sarah rather than Kerney. This is the second book that opens outside of New Mexico, and it opens in California, where Kerney goes to a quarter horse breeding ranch to look for some stock that he's interested in buying, and winds up becoming the prime suspect in a homicide.
That sounds fascinating. Well, we want to thank you today for joining us for Book Talk.
It's been my pleasure.
And we wish you much continued success in your career. Good luck to you. And thank you for joining us for Book Talk, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Friends of the Library helps to raise money for all 18 Memphis Public Library locations, their programs, and services. Donate as a one-time monthly or yearly contribution to help us continue to serve the approximately 2 million customers who enter Memphis Public Libraries annually.
You're watching the Library Channel, a broadcast service of the Memphis Public Libraries and the City of Memphis.